this computer. All right.
Okay, take it away.
I would like to tell you tonight some stories about my mother. This is my mother and me, Eileen Rossi Mattone. I was coming home from work one day and I was listening to the radio, and there was a report about busing in Newark, New Jersey, which immediately brought back memories of my childhood because my parents were never, ever going to let me be bused out of my town into Newark, New Jersey, which was not too far away. And I thought, I've got to call them when I get home. And so the minute I got in the door, I rang and no answer. About half an hour later, still no answer. And I thought, well, you know, since my mom retired, they've been going out to dinner, they've been going to movies, they've been seeing friends, so they're probably out. So I just went about my evening activities, had a lovely piece of chocolate cake from someone's birthday, and about 8:30 the phone rang, and it was actually my dad, who didn't usually call, and he said, well, your mother's in the hospital. She has pneumonia. You don't need to come down. Okay. So I hang up the phone and I go to bed, and I'm lying in bed and I'm thinking, this, you know, something doesn't feel quite right, but that's all right. He said she was, you know, she said she was fine. She didn't have a room. They were going to take care of her. Everything was fine. And, you know, I finally fell asleep, but the next morning I woke up and jumped in the car and got to work. And there was something about this. And I thought, I just have to go. I just have to go. I know people have pneumonia all the time, and I just want to see my mom and, you know, sit by her bed and hang out and help her feel better. So I had literally set up my classroom. My wife was on her way to work, and I was like, we need to do this. We need to go down. So I turn around and go straight back home. We dump the dogs off at the kennel. We leave notes for the neighbor for the cat. And we drive down, and I just had this impending sense. It's like, I really want to get there. I really want to get there. And I'm so distracted, I take the wrong turn. And so we have to go off, and then we have to turn around and come back. We finally get to my dad, you know, to the house, and my dad's there. And he said, oh, I saw her this morning. She's better. She's got her, you know, she's in a room. Everything's good. It's like, great. We hop in his car, drive to the hospital. It's not that far. And she wanted to go to a different hospital, but she ended up at the one closer. I don't know why. And we get to the hospital and asked to go up to her room. And I had never been in the intensive care unit in this hospital, never been in an intensive care unit in any hospital. And it was like this long corridor. And there were beds on both sides of the corridor with people and machines. And the clue for me should have been when they brought us to a private room. Because when I walked in, there was my mother. And I looked at my father, seeing my mother, turned to him and blurted out, you said she was better. Because this was clearly not better. This was my mother, flat on her back, intubated with machine breathing for her. Tubes in her arms, tubes everywhere. And my father, I think he just backed up and backed away. And I went and grabbed my mother's hand, and it was so swollen that she couldn't squeeze back. And so I dropped her hand and went to the head of the bed, and I started stroking her forehead. I just very gently stroking her forehead. And I said, it's okay, Mom. It's okay. And from the side of her eye, a tear came rolling down her cheek. And just like it happens in the movies, I couldn't believe it. The machines start going off, and they're pinging and buzzing, and all these machines. And this nurse comes in, and she starts talking to me, and she says, well, we've tried this and we've tried that, and I don't know. And would you like us to resuscitate her? And I just came from a 3.5-hour drive thinking that I was going to see my mother. So yes, please. Yes, if you're going to resuscitate her, do it. and they throw us out of the room. You know, later I thought, well, thank goodness my mother had the good sense at that point not to be resuscitated. I mean, I heard what I wanted to hear, but they couldn't resuscitate her and she was gone. And I remember standing by the side of her bed and my father was pressed up against the back of the wall. You know, I was just holding my mom's hand and I said to my dad, do you want to say goodbye? And he said, I would never touch a dead body. And he kind of vanished. But I stayed with my mom and held her hand and stroked her forehead and listened to the doctor tell me, you know, your mother was very sick when she came in. Her kidneys had failed. And again, I really didn't hear what he was saying. We left the hospital and we went home to this, you know, my father just started throwing things away and he didn't know what to do. And, you know, we were cooking dinner and calling relatives and visiting friends. And I remember lying in bed that night and my heart was pounding. And all I could think of was, she's gone. My mother's gone. I had lost my mother in that moment. Thank you. So this is my mother circa 1938 or 1939. So something to know about me and my mother, you know, nobody ever says, Mom, Dad, I'm gay. And they go, great, we're so happy for you. Just didn't happen. When I came out to my parents, it was over the phone, which was something my mother often said, you know, I wish you had told me in person. But my parents' response to my coming out was, it was just bad. My father told me that he wished I had a good life and that I was picking a very hard path and hung up the phone. My mother didn't hang up the phone, but over many phone conversations, tried to convince me that somehow you know, I could get a cat. I didn't have to have a partner in my life. I could just have a cat. Or she would ask those questions that in her generation she had been taught to ask. Who's the man in the relationship? Well, it doesn't work that way. Okay. You know, and it was, having been raised, she was a devout Italian Catholic. And the church had told her homosexuality is a sin. This is something that cannot be. And I often put myself in my mother's place and wondered what it must be like to have a child who I know she loved because she would call me every year right at the moment of my birth. 9/17, May 23rd, she would pick up that phone and call. She would do, you know, she would turn her wedding dress into a Halloween costume. This is a woman who clearly loved me and found herself in conflict with what her teachings had been. And unlike my father, who didn't talk to me for years, my mother kept calling. And sometimes I had to avoid those phone calls because I couldn't take those phone calls. But sometimes I took those phone calls, and very slowly we rebuilt the relationship we had. My mother started visiting. My mother would come and hang out. We would go down and we would stay at my wife and I would stay at their house. And slowly but surely, and right before she died, she was planning on getting an apartment up here in Massachusetts so that she could be near her daughter, as well as live in South Florida near her son. Now, did she ever really accept who I am? I don't really know. I know she was willing to open her heart to it. I do also know that after I came out, my brother shortly after got engaged to a Jewish woman. And as it turns out, being a Jew is actually worse than being a white lesbian. And so in the end, I think it all really worked out. Thank you. When I was 14, my mother and her sister, this is my mother and her 4 sisters. There were 3 surviving brothers. The sister in this picture is the youngest girl in the picture, who was my godmother and my mother's maid of honor. And they had a conversation about me, the upshot of which was I would take dance lessons because they were concerned about what they perceived as a rather obvious lack of femininity. Now, my mother in those old, in trying to, well, anyway, my rather obvious lack of femininity. And so I was going to take dance classes. And because the situation was so dire, I was going to go to one of the best dance schools around. And we would have to drive a half an hour either way. Now, my aunt was going to pay for these lessons. And truth be told, I would have rather had a baseball mitt or, a set of tools, but that wasn't to be. So dance class, and really, when you're like a closeted 14-year-old girl, dance class is actually not a really bad place to be because there are a lot of girls there and they're all in their leotards. So once a week, my mom and I would get in her old green duster that she had bought with money her dad had left her when he passed away. And this was those old, and it was that frog green, and it had manual steering. So she must have had arms of steel to turn the wheel of this thing. And we would hop in the car and we would drive a half an hour to dance class. I would do my thing and I would try. I learned first position and second position and third position, and I plied and I jumped and I danced. And then we got in the car and went home. And those hour conversations were some of the best times that I had had with my mother. Now, my dad and my brother were both loud and took up a lot of space. And getting space for my mother and time all to myself was something that was rare and difficult to come by. And so we had those half hours. Now, we did this for 3 years until my mother was actually diagnosed with breast cancer, and she needed to stop and have her radiation. And the good news was she was a 28-year survivor, 25-year survivor, something like that. So it wasn't a horrible illness, but she needed time to recuperate. And I was going to be on the yearbook and I needed time after school. So those dance lessons ended. Now, I thought that I had learned some feminine skills. And in fact, when I got to college, I took PE. I took Ballet 1 because, of course, I could plie and dance with the best of them, yes. Except that at the end of that first class, the teacher called me over and she said, not the class for you. You need to drop this class. So as it turns out, the dance classes were actually a failure. However, those hours spent with my mother were better than any dance lessons I could ever have. Plus, I got to look at a couple of girls. Thank you. Right. So I'd like to share a little bit. So my family is kind of an interesting dynamic. My mom being 7 and 9 years younger than her next closest siblings, got to know a lot of my aunt's friends. They were kind of like her second parents. And one of my aunt's friends was a woman named Geraldine or Jerry. And Jerry had a brother whose name also happened to be Jerry. And my mother needed a date. And apparently Jerry was interested. And so my mother's sisters and my father's sister were lifelong friends. And what that meant was that our families were intertwined. And my dad had 4 sisters. The youngest was Millie, who was as profane as she was profound. My favorite comment from my Aunt Millie was when she had a dog that had had puppies, and the dog wouldn't feed the puppies. So she picked the dog up, put the dog in the box, looked at the dog and said, "You fuck for them, you feed them." And I have carried that advice for a long time. Now, my Aunt Millie was she could be a little emotional as well. And, my mom always tried to help her kind of overcome those emotions. Like the time my Aunt Millie wanted to be buried with her mother's wedding ring. And my mom said, "Gee, your sons might want it to give to their wives." At which point my aunt picked up her birthday cake and threw it at the door. That was Aunt Millie. But Aunt Millie loved my mother. Then there was Geraldine, who I mentioned before. And Geraldine and my mom shared crafting. They shared Christmas Eve. My aunt always spent Christmas Eve with us. When my aunt had knee surgery, it was my mother who came and took care of her. Or actually, my aunt came to my mother's house and my mother took care of her. And when my mother died, it was my Aunt Geraldine who walked into the funeral home and said, crying, and I've never seen my aunt cry ever, sobbing and saying, "Eileen, you were my best friend." And there was my Aunt Lucy. My Aunt Lucy was, I'd like to say the old stereotype, they really broke the mold when they made her. And I really hope they did, because she was the quintessential middle child. The poverty that they lived in scarred her in ways that it did not scar her other siblings. And she was loud, and she was in your face, and she was going to get what you wanted when she wanted. Apparently, she also had the best cheesecake recipe ever, which she shared with my mother. And my mother, when my Aunt Lucy, as only my Aunt Lucy could do, she was run over by a car, killed, leaving a funeral home. And my mother said she never got to have a last piece of cheesecake. And finally, there was my Aunt Helen. My Aunt Helen was my dad's oldest sister. And she was the one who did things like provide the family with their first Christmas gifts, because the poverty they lived in, they just didn't have that opportunity. My Aunt Helen was the one who found my mother lying on the floor when she was sick. And she was the one who called 911 and got my mother to the hospital that day. My Aunt Helen was the one who stepped in very quietly and unobtrusively when my mother died, and did those small things that mothers do without really making it obvious. And the thing that these 4 women had in common was how much they loved my mother as a sister-in-law. And at times they've been known to say that they loved my mother more than they loved their own brother. She was a well-loved woman from them. Thank you. All right. I'd like to share another picture, because my mom was also a friend to many. These are some of her coworkers. And if you don't know, here she is.
Oh.
She looks kind of familiar. My family is not a particularly sentimental family. My mother was actually pretty sentimental. She liked having all her ducks in a row. She liked having all her family around her. Nothing made her happier than having a family dinner with everybody she loved at the table. But really, weren't that sentimental. My dad would, for my mother's birthday, my dad would get her things like a picture window, new basement stairs, a new front door, all sorts of things. So now when my mother got sick, he had taken her wedding and her engagement ring, brought them home and put them in a paper cup on top of the fridge where he could have them ready to give back to her when she came home. And of course, she didn't come home. And my mom had, and I remember looking at her wedding and engagement ring, and, you know, she was, and she, it's like a 1-carat rock. It's a pretty big rock. And I remember looking at it with her, and she was saying, oh, I always wished I had something a little bigger, but I really do love my wedding ring, and this is going to be yours someday. And she had a gold bracelet that was going to go to my brother. So my father had these rings, and it just really, there was no point in, not even no point. It was just in poor taste to me after my mother died to say, well, can I have the rings? And with my dad, that would be the surest way not to get the rings. But, you know, I waited and I waited and I waited, and several years went by. And when we would go to visit my dad, he kept everything in a drawer, and I would open the drawer and I would kind of take a peek. And at some point, the wedding ring disappeared, and I just didn't ask. But the engagement ring stayed. And after maybe 4 or 5 years, my dad started to say, I'm going to sell the ring. And I would say, oh, please don't sell the ring. I'd like to have mom's ring. Why do you want the ring? Well, it was mom's. I'm going to sell the ring. And then, please don't sell the ring. And then he would kind of subside for a few months. And next thing I'm going to sell the engagement ring. It's worth $1,000. I'll pay you $1,000. I'll take the ring. Why do you want the ring? Well, because it was mom's. It's worth $1,000. You could sell it. I don't want to sell the ring. I'd just love to have it. So this went on for several years, going back and forth. And I often don't ascribe a whole lot of sentiment to my father. And I don't know if he was trying to decide if he was ready to get rid of the ring, if he really thought we should sell the ring, or if he was playing a game with me to see if I would try to take the ring from him. And I just let it go until one day he called and he said, I'm going to send you the ring. And he said, okay. Are you going to insure it? I can't insure it. Then people will know it's worth something. Okay. Let me know when the ring gets there. A couple of days later, I go out to the mailbox and there's a great big mailing envelope, one of those flimsy kind of plasticky envelopes. It's big. It's like 9 by 12. And it feels like there's nothing in it. So I tear it open and I drop this ring, and the ring comes out. It's not wrapped in tissue paper. It's not in a box. It's not anything. He's just dropped this ring in the envelope. So I run inside and I put the ring on and I pick up the phone and I say, Dad, the ring came. I said, and he said, well, you know, it's worth $1,000. And I said, oh, I'm going to send you the appraisal. We had it appraised. Okay. A week later, I get an envelope in the mail. I rip this envelope up, open. I pull out the appraisal from 1960. And this is maybe 8, 9 years ago. So it was from 1960. And it was indeed worth $1,000 in 1960. So my next stop was the jeweler where I had it appraised. And the stop after that was the insurance company where I changed my insurance to cover the value of this ring. And every now and then, before my dad died, did you sell the ring? No, Dad, I'm not selling the ring. Why don't you sell the ring? I don't want to sell the ring. And I have to tell you, I don't know if I'll ever sell the ring. I don't know if I would give it to my nephews. I'm not exactly sure, but what I do know right now is that I have the ring. I don't wear it right now because it was a diamond with 2 baguettes on the side, and I have lost one of the baguettes, and I'm afraid of losing the other one. But what I really want right now is I just want to have that piece of my mom that she promised me that I could have. Thank you. So as I've mentioned, we're not a particularly sentimental family. And given that, I have an incredibly complicated relationship with gifts. I like to give gifts that are unexpected. I would like nothing better right now than to give you all one of the tomatoes that had come from my garden. Those are the kind of gifts I want to give. I really chafe at the idea that I'm supposed to give you a gift on Valentine's Day or your birthday because I love you all year round. And I don't want it to be a ritual. I don't want it to be a responsibility. And I often wondered about where this came from. I mean, as I said, the gifts in our family tended to be quite practical. In fact, before she died, the last birthday gift my mother bought me was a garden cart for my garden. And I've actually come to see the wisdom in some of these practical gifts. But I think it might have started when I was just shy of 8 years old. I was in 3rd grade and Mother's Day had rolled around. And I hadn't bought a gift. My dad hadn't taken us to buy any gifts. And my mother had done, it was her usual Sunday routine. We had gone to church. We had gone to Sunday school. We came home. My mother was making the Sunday dinner. There was either a roast or there was pasta. There was always a salad. She was, my dad had helped, but my mother was making Sunday dinner. And at one point she turned to me and she said, "Where's my Mother's Day gift?" And being an almost 8-year-old, I said, I'm sorry, almost 9-year-old, I said, "Well, I don't have a gift." At which point my mother lost her shit and started screaming and yelling at me. "I'm your mother. It's Mother's Day. I deserve a gift. You need to get me a gift." I ran upstairs and raided whatever little money I had in my piggy bank, booked it down the stairs, and ran around the corner to where there was the drugstore. And in the drugstore, they had, cards and little doodads. And this is 1972. And so I'm looking around and they have these little plastic statues. And there's these little smiley face people. And there's a little outstretched arms and it says, "I love you this much." And I thought, this has to be the right gift. And so I bought that gift, ran home with it, gave it to my mother, who put it on her bedside table for the next 30 odd years. And I often wondered what was so special about that gift, because I'd been guilted into it. And I know now that it wasn't me she was mad at, in the sense that really my dad should have taken us to get gifts, or in my opinion, my dad should have taken us to get gifts, but we hadn't. But she kept that gift. But, she kept that gift, but there was one other gift. Right before my mom died, we had gone down to celebrate Easter. My brother and his wife and the 2 grandchildren had come up, and they were little. The boys were small, like 1 and 4 and not even 3 and 5. And we were, hanging out and doing Easter. And I had right before, maybe a few weeks before, we had been talking, and my mom had said, "Oh, there's this wonderful cucumber green tea. I just love it." And I happened to be at the grocery store, and there it was on the shelf. And so, knowing we were going down, I just grabbed a box. And, we'd gone down and we'd had dinner, and, we got the boys to bed, and everybody kind of, once things were quiet and the kitchen had calmed down, I ran upstairs, came back down and said, "Hey, Mom, you said you like that tea and I found you some." And she looked at me and she said, "Why did you buy that? It's so expensive." And I said, "But Mom, I bought it for you. And in that moment, I think I made up for that Mother's Day. And that was the last gift that I gave my mother. But I also think it was the best gift because she threw her arms around me as if I had given her the world. Thank you. Be fine. All right, so this is my mother and one of her and my younger nephew. She loved nothing better than being a grandmother. This is my final story. And this story actually has a title. It's called My Mother's Quilt. And now see, if sewing were all about choosing fabric, I would be the best quilter and the best seamstress in the world. Because there's nothing I love better than walking into a fabric store and looking at all those fabrics and thinking about all the things that someone else could make me. Because my idea of sewing is pins and tape. Now, back in the 70s, we took sewing. Girls took sewing in 8th grade. Boys took shop. If you had a penis, you went down the hall this way. If you had a vagina, you went down the hall the other way. And so there I was in sewing when I really rather would have been in shop. And we were tasked with making something. And I wasn't going to, clearly this lack of femininity, I wasn't going to be making a skirt. I wasn't going to be making a dress. And, I can barely thread a needle, right? I can I'm the one who's going in the back, can barely thread it. What am I going to make? A jacket, because I want to make a jacket. And I get to pick the fabric, which is what I'm good at, right? And remember, this is the 70s. So my mom takes me to the fabric store and I'm walking up and down the aisles and I can't use this fabric because it's too bulky and I can't use that fabric, but I finally find the perfect fabric. It's bright, bright, bright blue with hot pink strawberries the size of golf balls. And I bring this fabric into class and I start all those things that sewing students do. First, I have to figure out the pattern, and then I have to cut out the pattern, and I have to figure out how to fold it back up. Then I have to pin everything. Then I have to cut everything out. By this time, I'm already done. And the sewing teacher would walk up and down the aisles. And I remember I'd be sitting in the back in my little patch of sunshine, and I'd be trying to thread the needle, and I'd be trying to cut a straight seam or sew a straight seam. And she'd walk up and down and she'd be smiling at all the other girls as they were making their skirts and their blouses. And then she'd get to me. But I persevered. I maybe even got an A in that class because I did make a jacket. And I have to tell you, it was the ugliest jacket to come out of the 20th century. Even better, my cousin made me a hat to go with it. I'm pretty sure that very quickly my mother got rid of the jacket and the hat. And that was my experience with sewing. Now, my mother, she could take her wedding dress and turn it into a Halloween costume for me. When she was in her 40s, she took up quilting. And I'm telling you, if I don't have the patience for sewing a jacket, I am never sewing a quilt. Although I've learned never to say never, but I'm pretty sure I'm never making a quilt because there's, again, talk about patterns and cutting hundreds of squares of pieces of material and pinning hundreds of squares together. But my mother loved it. And one of the things that I think she also loved about it was I called her the queen of small gifts because she just loved to give gifts, not unlike my garden tomatoes. And so if you know a quilter, if you have a quilter in your life, they will make a quilt for anybody, anywhere, anytime, any place. And my mother did. She made baby blankets for people. She made quilts for people at work. She made blankets that I have my cousins send me pictures of that they had for their children that are now using for their grandchildren. And my mother loved making quilts. And around the time I started teaching in public school, I had seen a quilt at a quilt show. And it's called a bug jar quilt. And it's got, the fabric is fabric with insects on it, cut out, shaped like jars in rows. And I thought, this is the quilt for my classroom. And I said to my mom, you know, there's this bug jar quilt, and I'd really love it for my classroom. And she said the magic words, you can pick the fabric. Woohoo! I went to every fabric store within a 50-mile radius of my house. I picked out, and I touched everything. I petted everything, and I picked out fireflies, and I picked out ladybugs. I even snuck some frogs in because I really liked frogs, and gave my mother all this material. And she said, I'll get right on it. And so, you know, sometimes in life, things work out exactly the way you hope they do, but sometimes they don't. And it was just as my mother was making this quilt that she died. And the day after she died, I took her house apart because I knew she had been working on this quilt. And I tore through every secret compartment and every box she had in her craft room. And finally, I found it. I pulled it out, and it was the front. There was no back. There was no border. There was no stuffing. And I knew there weren't enough pins and tape in the world that could finish this quilt. Now, at the time my mother died, and while she was making this quilt, I had been working at a school. It was my second school that I had worked in as an elementary school teacher. And I had been pretty unceremoniously transferred to another school for the following year. So I was losing my community. I was having to think about joining a new community, and I'd lost my mom. Now, there was a parent at this school. I never had her child, but I would see her at the end of the day, and she and I would talk, and you couldn't find anybody really as different from my mother as she was. She probably still has a Bernie sticker on her car, Bernie for president, and maybe more than one. My mother was a lifelong Goldwater Republican. This woman was Jewish. My mother was Catholic. She was wildly non-conventional. My mother was extremely conventional. And yet this woman kept saying to me, what can I do for you? I know you're being moved to a new school. I'm not happy about it. What can I do for you? And along the line, somebody had said, you know, she's a quilter. And I said, gee, I know something you can do for me. Would you mind finishing the quilt that my mother started for my classroom? And just like my mother would have done, this woman said yes in a heartbeat. And she finished that quilt. And I hang it in my classroom every school year. And it reminds me of all the gifts that people have given me, but most especially the gift of my mother, and how it reminds me that we can all be the queen of small gifts. And I have the quilt here.
Oh, look at that.
And those are my stories. Thank you for listening to Stories of My Mother. The death of my father has given me the time and space to celebrate her.
Oh, wow.
That's so wonderful. Well, yes, those are wonderful stories. And
Thank you.
Brother Blue said you've taken us up the mountain with you and connected from the middle of you to the middle in the middle of us.